Hello and welcome to the Great Missenden Timeline. We are going to be telling you all the events in chronological order, which just means in the events that happened, all about human history. So let's get our time travelling hats on and let's go back all the way to prehistoric times and the Stone Age.
Me, Stone Age man. Actually, I don't know why I'm talking like that. We don't know that Stone Age people talk like that. They were probably very similar to us. They certainly were as clever as us. About 3.3 million years ago, humans started to appear in Britain. This was the Stone Age, and it lasted for a really long time. Around 179,000 years ago, we discovered fire, which was really good because it's quite chilly in Britain. We used fire to help us make new tools and to hunt and eat food. Yum. We were hunter-gatherers, which meant, pretty obviously really, we hunted some things and we gathered others. We hunted animals that we still see today, like deer and rabbits, and animals that are now extinct, like the giant woolly mammoth. We gathered fruit and nuts and plants, all of the things that we could eat, and down by the seaside we gathered lots of lovely shellfish too. Stone Age was called the Stone Age because we used stone. It was the material we made our tools and our weapons out of, and we were great at it. But eventually we discovered a new material that was even better. We discovered bronze. Bronze was brilliant. It was really easy to shape. We could heat it up and make all sorts of things, and it was really sharp. Great for hunting animals. It was quite difficult to find though. I needed to get copper and tin to make bronze. They're quite difficult to find. So after a while, the Bronze Age faded out and we got iron instead. Iron is harder, it's tougher, and it's easier to find. This was the Iron Age, a great time to be alive. Now, the prehistoric period didn't end all in one go all around the world. It ended at different times in different places. In Britain, the end of that time ended when the Romans invaded us. But it was good whilst it lasted. There you go, 3.3 million years in about 3 minutes.
So, the Ancient Age, where do we start? Well, it actually started at the end of the Iron Age and ends with the fall of the Roman Empire 500 years after Christ. We call this AD. During this period, the first civilizations arose and developed. I'm sure you've heard of them: Egypt and its pyramids and pharaohs, Greece and its wise philosophers and the Olympics, Rome and its strong gladiators and vast empire. There was a lot of war during the Ancient Age, and trading, swapping goods, became bigger. And trading started happening between different countries, meaning we got lots of different things from new places. We have lots of things now that we wouldn't have had if it wasn't for this. So there we go. The Ancient Age is made up of the history of ancient Egyptians and its pharaohs and pyramids, and use of the River Nile for trading. Ancient Rome with its strong warriors and vast empire, and ancient Greece with its philosophy and the beginning of the Olympics. Another important part of history was the Maya civilization. This began long ago in a place called Mesoamerica, which basically means Middle America. This huge area is made up of what is now Mexico and a part of Central America. Even though they lived in different cities ruled by different kings and queens, the Maya shared a lot of common beliefs and traditions. They were experts at reading the stars and even built their cities as a map of the sky. They were also inspired by the creatures of the forest and shared many legends about animals, plants, and natural spirits. The Maya used their knowledge of astronomy and mathematics to devise calendars. It is thought that cocoa beans were first cultivated in ancient America, in particular the drink hot chocolate.
So let's have a look back at England. So the Romans had invaded and ruled over England for about 400 years. However, they left to go back to Rome to defend their home from fierce tribes. Enter the time of the Saxons and then the Vikings. This happened around 1600 years ago, and England looked very different to how it does now. Each part of England was ruled by a different king, and most people lived out in the countryside so they could make a living from farming. The Anglo-Saxons were warrior farmers and came from the northwest of Europe. They were very good at hunting, fighting, making textiles and their leather production. The Anglo-Saxons ruled Britain for around 500 years, and many families are actually descendants from the Anglo-Saxon ancestors.
So now, we move on to about 1200 years ago when the Viking Age started and lasted for about 200 years. From across the North Sea, just like the Anglo-Saxons, came the Vikings and took England for their own. They were known as fearsome and deadly warriors. They also were great explorers and traveled all over the world, as well as settling in England and farming peacefully. Did you know that we still use some of their words today, like egg, muck, and dirt? Also, some modern town names also come from Norse words, like York and Derby. How cool is that? Unfortunately, King Edward III, who was the King of England at this point, died and left no one to take his place on the throne. This started a war, and the Normans invaded England in 1066, which was called the Battle of the Hastings, and destroyed the Anglo-Saxon era when William the Conqueror won. A few years later, William built the Tower of London, which is still there today. How many have seen it?
Now we're going to move on to the Tudor era. This was around 500 years ago. The Tudors were a Welsh-English family that ruled England and Wales from about 1485 to 1603. They ruled for 118 years and had two of the strongest monarchs on the English throne, Henry VIII and Elizabeth I. I'm sure that you have probably heard about Henry VIII and his 6 wives. During this time, England became richer than ever. Towns grew, more houses were built, and schools and colleges were set up, which, as we know, is really important. However, this meant towns became more crowded and travelling became really, really difficult. As well as this, diseases spread far, far quicker. Because the towns got richer though, this meant art became more important, and people often went to go see plays. Did you know that the Tudor era is when Shakespeare was born and the Globe Theatre was built? So the Tudor times, full of art, full of history and plays, and as well, the schools being set up. See you later. I'm off to go see Romeo and Juliet.
In 1666, a huge fire burnt down most of London. The fire was so big that it was called the Great Fire of London. The fire began in a bakery in Pudding Lane. It lasted for 4 days and burnt down over 13,000 homes. There are a lot of reasons why the fire was so large, mostly to do with the way houses were built. A lot of them were made from wood and straw, and they were very close together. People whose homes had burnt down lived in tents in the fields around London while buildings were being rebuilt. We know what happened during the fire because people back then wrote about it in letters and newspapers. For instance, Samuel Pepys wrote about it in his diary. Artists who were alive in 1666 painted pictures of the fire afterwards, so we know what it would have looked like if we'd been there too. Here's an example. When houses were rebuilt, a lot of them were made in bricks instead of wood, and they weren't built so close together. Sir Christopher Wren designed a monument to remember the Great Fire of London, which still stands today.
Now let's jump ahead to 1837 and the reign of Queen Victoria. At the time of the Victorians, Queen Victoria ruled for nearly 64 years. Wow. During the Victorian era, Britain built a huge empire as it was one of the richest and powerfulest countries in the world. During this time in history, Britain gained some great things that we still use today. For example, piped water, gas and railways, originally meant just to transport goods across the country, not people. Lots of factories and also lots and lots of inventions that we still use today. But what kind of inventions happened at this time, I hear you ask? Well, the first photographs were taken in 1830s, of course in black and white, and you had to stand very still for a long time, very different to our photos now, and this is how the past has influenced our life nowadays. Thomas Edison invented the light bulb in 1879 in America, which was a big change to the life of Victorian people. Another big part of the Victorian era was the Industrial Revolution. Because of all these wonderful inventions and work opportunities in the cities and towns, many people moved to there in order to work. The Industrial Revolution gained pace because of the power of steam, which was used to develop bigger, faster and better machines. But many of the people who worked in these factories and produced all of these wonderful things were incredibly poor. Children and women were put in awful working conditions in factories. Yes, children worked in factories. In 1840, things began to change for workers in factories as some rules were put into place to make sure that these factory workers were treated fairly and safely. This is when young children were banned from working in factories. Few. They could also go to school at this point. Towards the end of the Victorian era, the suffragists and the suffragettes fought for the rights of women's votes. Suffragettes were more activists and suffragists were more talking about things, and they didn't use action as much as the talking. Someone who was very special at this time was someone called Florence Nightingale. Miss Collier, over to you.
Florence Nightingale was an amazing nurse who helped lots of people during the Crimean War, 1954 to 1956. She was asked to work in some hospitals, helping some of the wounded soldiers, and found that the hospitals were a horrible place. Florence thought that this was not right and she wanted to help. So along with some of her nurses, she set off feeding the soldiers and caring for them so they got better faster. Did you know that Florence Nightingale was often called Lady with the Lamp, as she was so dedicated to her job that she would often keep soldiers company and care for them at night, sitting by their bedside. How amazing was she? So that's a little insight into Florence Nightingale. What an incredible woman she was during the 1800s.
Now, we are going to jump ahead to the last 100 years, the 1900s. It was a very busy 100 years, and we know quite a lot about it because we have lots more evidence. There's pictures, diary entries, even videos from this time documenting what happened, and diary entries we use a lot when we're researching and looking into World War I and II. So first things first, in the 1900s there were two huge wars that most of the world got involved in. We call these the First World War and the Second World War. We call them this because these wars affected the whole world, not just one or two people. It was a very unsettling and scary time for the people involved, and the First World War lasted from 1914 all the way to 1918. That's 4 whole years, and it started when Germany invaded Belgium. And so, standing up to its promise, sticking up for Belgium, Britain declared war on Germany. And then the world was at war. It was a horrible time for all involved. Soldiers fought in horrible conditions in the trenches, and this war was very different from conflicts of the past. For the first time, powerful new weapons and vehicles were used at sea, on land and in the air, resulting in many people being killed or wounded. After the war ended in 1918 and Germany lost, they had to give up lots of their land and they were banned from armed forces. However, in 1933, Germany voted for a man called Adolf Hitler to become leader of the country. He promised to get back the land that they had lost and began to invade other countries. And in 1939, when Germany invaded Poland, France and Britain decided to step in and declare war. Lots of other countries got involved too because they wanted to protect their land as well. Because it was such a dangerous time for everyone, people had to evacuate to the countryside, and children were sent away from their families to keep safe, and people who lived in towns and cities carried gas masks in order to keep them safe from attacks. Shops were half empty of things to buy, and lots of things had to be rationed, and people could only get a certain amount of those things from the shops. It wasn't a great time for anyone. But in 1945, Germany lost, and it took a long time for the world to recover from all of the horrible things that happened during that period. But we know that it did.
And here we are in 2021. We've had a very lot of history in a short space of time, but we have one thing to think about. We have seen lots of people changing history and making a good impact on history. So I'll leave you with this. How can we make an impact on our world today?